Have you ever felt like you're living in two different worlds? One world where everyone seems to naturally accept the rules of the game, where people move with almost automatic confidence through systems that to you seem fundamentally questionable, and another world, your inner world, where a persistent voice whispers that something is deeply wrong with the way we organize our lives, our societies, our most basic values. If you know that feeling of being out of place, that experience of being the only one in the room who seems to see the giant elephant everyone is ignoring, then you're not alone. In fact, you might be experiencing something Yuval Noah Harari has identified as one of the most troubling phenomena of our time: the systematic silencing of those who have developed a sharper awareness of the fundamental contradictions of our age. Imagine the following scene for a moment. You're in a work meeting, or maybe at a family dinner, or even in a casual conversation with friends. Someone casually mentions how normal it is to work 60 hours a week to afford an apartment that barely feels like home, or how natural it is for children to spend more time staring at screens than playing outside, or how it's inevitable that we must constantly consume to keep the economy running. And while everyone nods in agreement, you feel a growing unease. A voice in your head asks, why do we accept this as normal? Why don't we question these structures that seem to drain our vitality? But when you dare to voice these questions, when you try to share your concerns, something interesting and disturbing happens. People around you begin to pull away, not physically, but emotionally. They change the subject, make jokes to ease the tension, or worse, start treating you as if you're overly pessimistic, complicated, or even mentally unstable. It's as if your ability to see through society's collective illusions is interpreted not as a sign of heightened awareness, but as a personal flaw that must be corrected or silenced. This experience, you may have lived through countless times, reflects a much broader and more systematic pattern that Harari observed in his research on how human societies function. Throughout history, there have always been individuals capable of seeing beyond the dominant narratives of their time, people who could perceive the internal contradictions of the systems they were embedded in. However, our era has unique characteristics that make the silencing of these individuals more sophisticated and effective than ever before. To understand how we got to this point, we must first recognize a fundamental truth about the nature of human societies. They depend, for their functioning, on shared myths, collective stories that everyone agrees to believe in, even when those stories do not necessarily align with objective reality. 10,000 years ago, our ancestors believed in gods who lived in the mountains and controlled the harvests. Today, we believe in concepts like infinite economic growth, absolute meritocracy, and inevitable technological progress. The difference lies not in the truth of these beliefs, but in the complexity of the systems we've built to sustain them, and in the sophistication of the mechanisms we've developed to silence those who question them. Harari argues that the most striking feature of our era is not just the prevalence of these collective narratives, but the way we've developed extremely refined methods to neutralize intellectual dissent without resorting to physical violence or explicit censorship. In authoritarian societies of the past, questioners were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. In our society, they are subtly marginalized through much more elegant and therefore far more effective mechanisms. The first of these mechanisms could be called the pathologizing of critical consciousness. When someone systematically questions the fundamental structures of our society, when someone persistently sees through the collective illusions that keep our system functioning, that person is often redirected to the mental health system. Not because they have a genuine psychological disorder, but because their way of seeing the world represents a threat to the harmonious functioning of social machinery. Depression, anxiety, borderline personality disorder, autism spectrum, all these diagnoses can be applied to individuals whose main pathology is an excessive sensitivity to the contradictions inherent in our time. What's particularly insidious about this process is that it works even when the mental health professionals involved have the best of intentions. A therapist may genuinely want to help a patient who is suffering because they can't accept the normalcy of working in a morally questionable job, or because they feel alienated in a culture obsessed with status and consumption. But the help offered almost always focuses on adapting the individual to the demands of society, rather than questioning whether those demands are legitimate. The therapeutic goal becomes to help the person function better within the existing system, not to develop a deeper understanding of why the system might be causing suffering in the first place. The second mechanism of silencing is even more subtle, and perhaps for that reason, even more powerful. The creation of escape valves that channel critical energy into harmless directions. Our society has developed an extraordinary ability to absorb and neutralize dissent by turning it into a commodity, a consumer product. Protest music becomes the soundtrack for soda commercials. Revolutionary art becomes decoration in corporate offices. Counterculture movements become lifestyles that can be purchased in specialty stores. More importantly, we've created seemingly safe spaces where people can express their frustrations and questions without having any real impact on power structures. Social media serves as a perfect example of this phenomenon. They offer the illusion that we're participating in a great public debate, that our voices are being heard, that we can influence change through our posts and shares. In reality, they mainly serve as a way to capture and dissipate revolutionary energy, channeling it into endless debates within isolated bubbles that rarely translate into effective action in the real world. The person who could be organizing real movements for social transformation spends their energy on online debates that generate much heat but little light and certainly no significant structural change. The third mechanism may be the cruelest of all: the exploitation of the fundamental human need for belonging to keep questioners isolated and powerless. Human beings are social animals, and our mental health critically depends on feeling like we belong to a community, that we are understood and accepted by our peers. Individuals with higher critical awareness often find that their sharp insight condemns them to a peculiar form of loneliness. They see through the illusions that keep most people comfortable, but that clarity of vision puts them in a position where it's extremely difficult to form genuine connections with others. How do you maintain close friendships when you realize that most social conversations revolve around trivialities or the unconscious perpetuation of systems you find fundamentally problematic. How do you build romantic relationships when your partner seems perfectly comfortable with a lifestyle that to you represents a betrayal of your deepest values? This loneliness is not accidental. It is a natural byproduct of a system that rewards conformity and subtly punishes those who refuse to accept the basic premises upon which our society is built. The result is that the people most capable of articulating alternatives to the status quo often find themselves isolated, doubting their own perceptions, questioning whether it might just be easier to accept things as they are and find a way to adapt. But here we arrive at the most disturbing point of Harari's analysis. What happens when this process of silencing becomes so effective that even those with the highest potential for critical awareness begin to silence themselves before society needs to do it? When we internalize the mechanisms of control so deeply that we don't even realize we are censoring our own thoughts? This phenomenon, which we might call preventive self-silencing, can be observed in multiple areas of contemporary life. In academia, young researchers quickly learn which questions can be asked and which must be avoided if they want a successful career. In the corporate world, employees develop a refined intuition about which insights can be shared in meetings and which must be kept to themselves. Even in informal conversations, we develop internal sensors that alert us when we are approaching intellectual territory that might place us in conflict with social expectations. What's most frightening is that this process often happens completely unconsciously. We don't notice that we're editing our thoughts, filtering our perceptions, dulling our ability to see clearly, because we've learned through thousands of subtle social interactions that certain types of clarity are socially undesirable. We develop a kind of voluntary blindness that protects us from the discomfort of constantly being in conflict with the world around us, but also deprives us of the ability to contribute to the transformations our society so desperately needs. Harari suggests that we are living in a particularly dangerous time because the challenges we face as a species require exactly the kind of critical thinking and radical questioning that our social systems are programmed to suppress. Climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, growing global inequality, these are all problems that cannot be solved within the conceptual frameworks that created them in the first place. We need people capable of questioning foundational assumptions, imagining radical alternatives, seeing beyond the limits imposed by the dominant narratives of our time. But precisely these people are the ones our social systems are most determined to silence or neutralize. It's as if we're facing a burning house while systematically discouraging anyone who questions whether our traditional firefighting methods are suitable for this particular type of fire. The irony is that our survival may depend precisely on the voices we are working so diligently to silence. This paradox becomes even more evident when we consider the speed of technological transformations we are witnessing. Artificial intelligence is not just changing how we work or communicate. It is fundamentally altering what it means to be human in a world where machines can perform many functions we once thought uniquely ours. But public discussions about these transformations tend to be dominated by two equally inadequate perspectives: the naive technological optimism that sees every innovation as automatic progress, and the reactionary pessimism that simply wants to stop the clock and return to an idealized past. We have almost no room for the voices that could offer more nuanced perspectives, voices that could help us navigate these transformations more consciously and deliberately. These voices exist, but they are systematically marginalized because their analyses do not fit into the simplified categories that dominate public discourse. Pause for a moment and ask yourself which aspect of this technological future we're building most troubles you. Do you also find yourself late at night wondering whether we're building a world where our essential humanity will still have a place? I know many of us carry these concerns in silence, perhaps afraid of seeming old-fashioned or resistant to progress. But your concerns are valid and likely shared by more people than you think. If you feel this anxiety about our collective future, share in the comments a word or phrase that captures your main fear. Your voice could help create a space where we can honestly discuss these shared fears instead of suppressing them. And maybe by naming these fears together, we can begin to imagine ways to face them with greater wisdom and humanity. The question Harari invites us to contemplate is whether it is still possible to reverse this trend of silencing before it collectively renders us incapable of adequately responding to the existential challenges we face. He offers no easy or optimistic answers, but suggests that the first step is to recognize that the problem exists and to understand how it operates. The awareness that we are being subtly manipulated into self-censoring our most important insights is in itself a form of resistance. When we begin to notice the mechanisms through which we internalize conformity, when we become aware of how our need to belong can be exploited to keep us intellectually docile, we create the possibility of making more deliberate choices about when to conform and when to resist social pressures. This does not mean we should become systematically contrarian or question everything all the time. It means we must develop the ability to distinguish between genuine conformity based on values and analyses we consider valid and imposed conformity based on fear of the social consequences of thinking independently. One of Harari's most interesting proposals is the need to create new kinds of social spaces, spaces where radical questioning can flourish without automatically resulting in social marginalization. This may sound utopian, but there are already examples, although limited, of communities that have managed to create cultures where genuine intellectual disagreement is valued rather than punished. Some universities, some organizations, some online communities are able to maintain environments where it is safe to question fundamental premises, where the ability to see through collective illusions is recognized as a valuable contribution rather than a threat to social harmony. The challenge is to expand these spaces and make them more accessible to those who need them most. This requires a deep cultural shift in how we understand the role of intellectual dissent in healthy societies. Instead of seeing questioners as disruptive elements that need to be neutralized, we need to learn to see them as canaries in the coal mines, as early warning systems that can help us identify problems before they become crises. This also requires developing more sophisticated ways of distinguishing between constructive and destructive questioning, between genuine critique based on rigorous analysis and reflexive contrarianism based on resentment or confusion. Perhaps more importantly, Harari suggests that we need to fundamentally rethink the relationship between individuality and collectivity in our societies. The dominant model tends to present these two dimensions as fundamentally opposed. Either you conform to social expectations and sacrifice your individual authenticity, or you maintain your personal integrity and accept social isolation as the price. But this is a false dichotomy. It is possible to imagine forms of social organization that honor both the human need for belonging and the diversity of individual perspectives. In fact, truly healthy communities depend on this creative tension between social cohesion and intellectual diversity. The problem arises when the mechanisms that maintain social cohesion become so powerful that they stifle intellectual diversity, or when the celebration of individuality becomes so extreme that social cooperation becomes impossible. The balance between these forces is delicate and requires conscious attention and constant adjustment. In our time, the pendulum has clearly swung too far in the direction of forced conformity, and a correction is needed if we are to maintain our collective capacity for adaptation and growth. Harari's analysis also leads us to question some of our most basic assumptions about what constitutes mental sanity and psychological health. If a person is suffering because they cannot accept fundamental aspects of a society that may be on a destructive path, is it really appropriate to define the problem as residing in the person rather than in society? Obviously, there are genuine cases of mental illness that require therapeutic intervention, but there are also cases where what is diagnosed as individual pathology may be better understood as a healthy response to pathological circumstances. The ability to feel anguish in response to environmental destruction, growing social inequality, or the dehumanization of modern life may be a sign of elevated moral awareness, not psychological dysfunction. This does not mean we should romanticize suffering or discourage people from seeking help when they are struggling. It means we need more sophisticated frameworks to distinguish between suffering that indicates a need for individual adaptation and suffering that indicates a need for social transformation. It also means we need forms of therapy that can help people cope with existential anguish without necessarily eliminating the perceptions that are causing it. Another important implication of Harari's analysis is the need to rethink our educational systems. If one of the unconscious functions of modern education is to prepare people to accept without question the basic structures of our society, then it is not surprising that it tends to discourage exactly the types of critical thinking and radical questioning we most need. This does not mean we should abandon formal education, but it does mean we need educational approaches that cultivate the ability to question fundamental premises, that teach people to think independently, and that develop the emotional resilience necessary to deal with the loneliness and marginalization that can accompany non-conventional thinking. This requires educators who themselves have developed these capacities, who have learned to navigate the tension between teaching established knowledge and encouraging radical questioning. It also requires educational systems that can tolerate and even celebrate a diversity of perspectives, rather than merely rewarding those who can most efficiently reproduce the answers deemed correct. The most disturbing aspect of all this is the possibility that we may have already passed a tipping point, that the mechanisms of silencing have become so sophisticated and pervasive that our collective capacity for self-correction has been severely compromised. Harari offers no guarantees that it is still possible to reverse these trends, but he suggests that our only hope lies in the conscious and deliberate cultivation of spaces where radical questioning can still flourish. This may mean creating new institutions, developing new technologies, or simply forming informal communities of individuals committed to maintaining their ability to think independently. It may also mean developing new personal practices that help us maintain our clarity of vision amid the constant pressures to conform. Meditation, contemplation, journaling, all of these are practices that can help preserve internal spaces where non-conventional thoughts can arise and be examined before being automatically filtered out by our self-censorship mechanisms. Here we arrive at the heart of the question Harari presents to us. Our survival as a species may depend on our ability to keep the flame of radical questioning alive, even when all social forces conspire to extinguish it. This is not a task that can be delegated to experts or institutions. It is something each of us must assume as a personal responsibility. Every time we choose to express a non-conventional perspective, despite the social discomfort it may cause, every time we choose to maintain our ability to see through collective illusions, despite the loneliness it may entail, we are contributing to the preservation of something essential to humanity's future. Every time we create spaces where others feel safe to express their deepest questions, we are participating in the building of a culture that values critical awareness rather than suppressing it. This is not about becoming a revolutionary or a professional dissident. It is about keeping our capacity to think for ourselves awake and creating conditions where others can do the same. The vision Harari offers us is simultaneously dark and hopeful. Dark because it shows how we have been subtly trained to silence our own most important insights, how we have developed internal censorship mechanisms that may be depriving us of the wisdom we need most at this critical moment in human history. Hopeful because it suggests that once we understand these mechanisms, once we become aware of how they operate, we have the possibility to make different choices. Consciousness, Harari suggests, is the first step toward freedom. When we stop automatically silencing our sharpest perceptions, when we create spaces where genuine questioning can flourish, when we learn to value the diversity of perspectives, even when it makes us uncomfortable, we are participating in the creation of a different kind of society. A society robust enough to face the extraordinary challenges that lie ahead, flexible enough to adapt to circumstances we cannot predict, and wise enough to correct its own mistakes before they become irreversible catastrophes. If these reflections resonated with something you've been feeling, but perhaps haven't been able to fully articulate, know that you are not alone on this journey. There is a growing community of people awakening to these same insights, refusing to accept the silencing of their critical awareness, seeking ways to keep their questioning alive. By subscribing to the channel, you'll connect with others who share these concerns and this commitment to maintaining spaces where genuine thought can flourish. Every week, we explore together the great questions of our time, not to find definitive answers, but to develop our collective capacity to ask the right questions at the right moment. This is not just an intellectual journey, but a practice of resistance, a way to keep alive the flame of critical awareness in an era that constantly pressures us to extinguish it. Join us in this essential project of preserving and cultivating the human capacity to see clearly, to question boldly, and to imagine possibilities that do not yet exist, but may determine the future of our species.
Joel Goldsmith discovered something that shattered everything the church taught him about Jesus. It wasn't heresy. It wasn't blasphemy. It was the original teaching that got buried under 2,000 years of dogma and fear. What he found changed not just his spiritual practice, but the lives of thousands who dared to listen. This isn't about religion. This is about direct spiritual experience. The religious establishment didn't want you to know this. They built entire institutions on keeping you dependent, keeping you small, keeping you believing you need an intermediary between you and the divine. Joel discovered that Jesus never intended to be worshipped. He intended to show you what you're capable of becoming. The Christ isn't a person to pray to. It's a state of consciousness you can experience. Here's what they don't teach in Sunday school. Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is within you, not within him, within you. He said you would do greater works than he did, not pray harder to him. Do greater works yourself. Joel realized that every miracle Jesus performed was a demonstration of a spiritual law that you can access right now. This isn't metaphor, this is instruction. The truth Joel taught. Jesus came to reveal your divine nature, not to be the only one who has it. That changes everything about how you approach prayer, healing, and your entire spiritual life. You've been taught to beg. Joel discovered you're meant to realize what you already are. Traditional Christianity teaches separation. You're the sinner. Jesus is the Savior. God is unreachable except through approved channels. Joel discovered this creates a consciousness of lack that blocks every spiritual demonstration. You can't heal from a consciousness that believes you're separate from healing power. You can't manifest abundance while believing you're unworthy of divine grace. What Jesus actually taught was mystical union. Not someday in heaven. Right now, in this moment. The Christ consciousness isn't something Jesus possessed exclusively 2,000 years ago. It's the eternal truth of being that exists in you this very second. Joel called it recognizing your sonship, not earning it through good behavior or correct belief, recognizing what's already true. This is why your prayers haven't worked the way you hoped. You've been praying from a consciousness of need, asking an external God to change external circumstances. Joel discovered that true prayer is the recognition of what already is in spiritual reality. You don't beg for healing. You realize there's nothing in spirit that needs healing. The body reflects consciousness. When you grasp this, every gospel teaching transforms. Turn the other cheek isn't passive submission. It's refusing to accept the appearance of evil as power. Love your enemies isn't moral superiority. It's recognizing there are no enemies in spirit, only divine beings wearing masks of human personality. Here's the practice Joel taught that churches avoid. Stop praying to Jesus and start praying from the Christ consciousness. The difference is everything. Praying to Jesus keeps you in the beggar position, hoping someone with more power will intervene. praying from Christ consciousness means recognizing you already have access to the same infinite source that Jesus accessed. Jesus never said, "Worship me." He said, "Follow me. Learn what I learned. Do what I'm doing." The moment you make Jesus into God and yourself into a worm, you've missed the entire point of his teaching. Joel discovered that every time Jesus said "I," he meant the Christ within him. And that same "I" exists in you, not your human personality, the eternal divine identity beneath it. This is practical, not theoretical. When you face illness, instead of begging Jesus to heal you, you practice Christ consciousness. You don't deny the body's appearance. You simply refuse to give it ultimate reality. You recognize that in spirit, there is no disease, no lack, no limitation. As you rest in that truth, the body begins to reflect spiritual perfection. Joel proved this worked through decades of spiritual healing. Not positive thinking, not visualization, pure recognition of what's already true in the invisible realm of spirit. The external world has no choice but to conform to consciousness. That's spiritual law. The final piece Joel revealed: the cross wasn't God's punishment for humanity's sin. It was Jesus demonstrating that even death has no power over Christ consciousness. He didn't die to save you from hell. He conquered death to show you that your true identity can never be destroyed. You are not your body. You are not your circumstances. You are eternal spirit appearing as temporary human form. This understanding transforms suffering. You're not being punished. You're not being tested. You're simply experiencing the outpicturing of whatever consciousness you're holding. Change the consciousness, and the experience must change, not through willpower, through recognition of spiritual truth. Joel called it the practice of the presence of God, not a distant God you petition, the presence that is your very being. When you truly grasp that Christ consciousness is your consciousness, prayer becomes meditation. You're not talking to God. You're listening. You're not asking for things. You're receiving the awareness of what Spirit has already provided. Everything you've been seeking externally exists in the invisible realm of consciousness. Your work is to recognize it, accept it, and watch it appear. This is the truth they silenced because it puts spiritual power back in your hands. No priests required, no rituals necessary. Just you, practicing the presence, recognizing your divine sonship, and watching your entire reality transform from the inside out. Joel spent 50 years proving it works. Now it's your turn. Margaret sat in Joel's meditation class in 1952, terminally ill with what doctors called incurable. She'd prayed every prayer the church taught her. She'd begged Jesus to intervene. She'd confessed every sin she could remember. Nothing changed. Her body continued deteriorating. Joel looked at her with deep compassion and said something that shocked her. Stop praying for healing and start recognizing wholeness. For 3 weeks, Margaret practiced what Joel taught. Every morning, instead of listing her symptoms to God, she sat in silence, recognizing that in spirit, there is no disease. She didn't deny her pain. She simply refused to give it ultimate power. She stopped seeing herself as a sick woman begging for mercy, and started recognizing herself as spiritual consciousness, temporarily experiencing a physical challenge. The shift happened gradually, not instantly. First, the fear dissolved. Then the pain lessened. Within 2 months, her doctors found no trace of the disease they'd declared incurable. Margaret didn't get healed. She recognized she'd never been separate from wholeness. The body simply reflected the change in consciousness. This wasn't miracle. This was spiritual law in operation. Joel documented dozens of cases like Margaret's over 5 decades of ministry. People with tumors, heart disease, paralysis, mental illness. Not every case showed immediate physical healing, but every person who truly grasped Christ consciousness experienced inner transformation that changed everything. Some bodies healed, some didn't. But every consciousness that awakened found peace beyond circumstances. Robert was a successful businessman who'd built his empire through aggressive competition and ruthless strategy. He attended one of Joel's lectures in Hawaii, expecting religious platitudes. Instead, Joel spoke about consciousness creating experience. Robert scoffed. 3 months later, his business collapsed overnight. Partners betrayed him. Investments failed. He lost everything. Desperate and broken, Robert returned to Joel's teachings. This time he actually listened. Joel taught him that his consciousness of struggle and competition had attracted exactly what he feared most: loss and betrayal. The external world was simply reflecting his internal state. Robert began practicing what Joel called living from grace instead of law. Every morning for 6 months, Robert sat in meditation, recognizing divine abundance as the only reality. He stopped trying to manipulate circumstances and started resting in spiritual supply. He didn't visualize money. He recognized the infinite nature of Source. He didn't scheme to rebuild his business. He let consciousness guide him to right action. The rebuilding took 2 years, not 2 weeks. But what emerged was completely different from what collapsed. Robert created a business based on cooperation instead of competition, on service instead of exploitation. He prospered beyond his previous success, but this time from a consciousness of abundance rather than fear. Joel's teaching hadn't just restored his finances, it had transformed his entire relationship with life. Elizabeth spent 40 years in traditional Christianity, faithful and devout. She attended church every Sunday, served on committees, taught Sunday school. Yet she felt spiritually empty. Her prayers seemed to bounce off the ceiling. Jesus felt distant, unreachable. She loved God but couldn't feel God's presence. Joel's teaching found her when she was ready to give up on spirituality altogether. What shocked Elizabeth most was Joel's statement that she'd been taught to worship Jesus instead of learning from Jesus. She'd made him so divine that she'd missed his actual message. You have the same access to God that I have. For months, Elizabeth struggled with this idea. Wasn't it blasphemy to claim divine sonship? Joel gently showed her dozens of gospel passages she'd read for decades but never truly seen. The transformation happened during a silent meditation retreat. Elizabeth stopped praying words and simply sat in the presence. For the first time in her life, she felt what Joel called the click. A moment of recognition beyond thought where she knew, not believed, but knew, that Christ consciousness was her consciousness. Tears streamed down her face. This was what she'd been seeking for 40 years. Elizabeth didn't leave her church, but her practice changed completely. She no longer prayed to an external God. She practiced recognizing the presence within. Her relationships deepened. Her health improved. Her joy became unshakable because it no longer depended on circumstances. Joel had given her what traditional religion couldn't: direct spiritual experience. Thomas was a minister who secretly struggled with doubt. He preached salvation through Jesus, but privately wondered if any of it was real. He'd seen too many faithful people suffer, too many prayers go unanswered. When he discovered Joel's recordings, everything he thought he knew about Jesus shifted. Joel wasn't denying Jesus. He was revealing what Jesus actually taught before doctrine obscured it. The crisis came when Thomas realized he'd been teaching people to depend on external salvation instead of awakening to their divine nature. He'd kept them small and dependent when Jesus came to set them free. For 6 months, Thomas wrestled with whether to continue ministry. Joel's teaching gave him a new framework. He could serve without lying. He could honor Jesus while teaching Christ consciousness. Thomas gradually transformed his ministry. Instead of preaching sin and salvation, he taught meditation and presence. Instead of encouraging petition prayers, he guided people into recognition of what already exists in spirit. Some congregants left, uncomfortable with the shift, but others awakened to direct spiritual experience for the first time in their lives. 2 years into this new approach, Thomas watched his congregation transform. Healings occurred, relationships restored. People discovered peace they'd never found through traditional doctrine. Joel's teaching hadn't destroyed Thomas's ministry. It had fulfilled it by revealing what Jesus actually intended. Not worshipers, but awakened beings living from Christ consciousness. If these transformation stories inspire you to explore this hidden truth, like this video to help others discover Joel Goldsmith's revolutionary teaching. Subscribe for more mystical Christianity wisdom, and comment. Which story resonated most deeply with your spiritual journey? Beyond meditation, Joel taught a practice he called recognizing the nothingness of error. When you face any problem, your natural response is to fight it, fix it, or pray for its removal. Joel discovered this approach gives the problem power. Instead, you practice recognizing that in spiritual reality, the problem doesn't exist, not as denial of appearance, but as recognition of what's true in consciousness. Here's how it works practically. You face a financial crisis. Traditional religion says pray to God for money. Positive thinking says visualize abundance. Joel taught something radically different. Recognize that in spirit, there is no lack, period. You don't try to change the external circumstance. You rest in the awareness that divine supply is infinite and always available. As consciousness shifts, circumstances must reflect that shift. This practice requires spiritual maturity. You're not pretending the problem isn't there. You're refusing to give it ultimate reality. You acknowledge the appearance while recognizing that appearances are temporary and consciousness is cause. The bank account shows zero, but spiritual reality knows nothing of limitation. You hold both truths simultaneously without trying to manipulate the outer to match the inner. Joel proved this principle through decades of demonstration. Not every problem dissolved immediately, but every consciousness that genuinely rested in spiritual truth eventually saw external confirmation. The timing isn't yours to control. Your work is recognition, not manifestation. Manifestation happens automatically when consciousness aligns with spiritual reality. Joel taught another complementary practice, living in the now. Not as New Age philosophy, but as spiritual law. The only place Christ consciousness exists is this present moment. Your mind wants to live in past regrets or future anxieties. Joel discovered that every spiritual problem exists only when you leave the now. In this moment, stripped of mental commentary, where is the problem? Practice this right now. Put aside past and future completely. What's happening in this exact second? You're alive. You're conscious. You're reading these words. Is there suffering in this pure moment, or only in the thoughts about other moments? Joel taught that the practice of presence isn't escaping life. It's discovering where life actually exists. Here, now, always. This transforms prayer from petition to presence. You don't ask God to fix your future. You recognize God as the only power operating in this present moment. Every gospel teaching Jesus gave was about now. The kingdom of heaven is at hand means it's available right now, not after death. Consider the lilies means stop projecting into tomorrow and see divine provision operating today. As you practice living in the now, you'll notice something remarkable. Problems lose their grip because they exist only in time. Pain might be present, but suffering about pain requires thought about past or future. Joel wasn't teaching you to ignore life. He was showing you where real life happens, in this eternal moment of Christ consciousness that never leaves the present. The third complementary practice Joel taught was recognizing oneness, not as mystical poetry, but as practical reality. Every problem you face stems from the belief in separation. You're separate from God, from supply, from health, from other people. Joel discovered that this belief in separation is the only actual sin, which means missing the mark of truth. Spiritual reality knows only oneness. When someone wrongs you, traditional religion says, forgive them. Joel taught something deeper. Recognize there's no separate person to forgive. There's only one divine consciousness appearing as many forms. The person who wronged you is Christ consciousness temporarily forgetting itself, just as you sometimes forget your divine nature. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior. It removes the emotional charge that keeps you trapped. Practice this with every relationship challenge. Instead of seeing an enemy, recognize a divine being experiencing human confusion. Instead of feeling victimized, recognize that nothing in spirit can actually be harmed. Your eternal identity is untouchable. The human personality might feel hurt, but Christ consciousness remains forever whole and complete. This oneness extends to everything you desire. You're not separate from the abundance, health, or peace you seek. They're not out there waiting to be acquired. They exist in consciousness right now. Your work isn't pursuing them. Your work is recognizing you've never been separate from them. As that recognition deepens, external experience must confirm what consciousness knows. Joel's final complementary practice was what he called living by grace. Grace isn't God's mercy toward sinners. Grace is the automatic flow of divine good that operates when you stop trying to earn, manipulate, or control. Every attempt to make something happen comes from the belief that you're separate from Source. Living by grace means recognizing that Source is already supplying everything before you ask. This practice feels terrifying to the human mind. You stop planning, stop strategizing, stop trying to force outcomes. You simply rest in spiritual truth and let consciousness guide you to right action. This isn't passivity. It's the most active spiritual practice possible because it requires constant vigilance against the mind's desire to take control and make things happen through human effort. Joel proved this principle repeatedly. He never advertised his lectures or promoted his books. He simply taught what he'd discovered, and thousands found their way to him. Divine grace supplied everything needed without manipulation or hustle. The human mind rebels against this approach, insisting you must do something. Joel discovered that spiritual consciousness is always doing everything. Your work is getting out of the way. As you practice these complementary tools alongside recognizing Christ consciousness, your entire spiritual life transforms. You're no longer a beggar approaching an external God. Your consciousness recognizing itself as the presence and power of God, right here, right now. Everything Jesus taught becomes practical instruction instead of impossible ideals. Here's the challenge nobody mentions. When you first practice Christ consciousness, your circumstances might get worse before they improve. Joel warned his students about this. You're shifting from one state of consciousness to another, and the transition can be turbulent. Old patterns resist dying. The ego fights recognition of its unreality. Problems you've been avoiding surface for healing. Sarah practiced Joel's teaching faithfully for 3 months and watched her life fall apart. Her marriage hit crisis. Her business struggled. Her health declined. She called Joel in desperation, convinced she was doing something wrong. Joel's response shocked her. Everything false in your life is being revealed so truth can replace it. Don't abandon the practice now. Go deeper into Christ consciousness. This is where most people quit. They return to traditional prayer, begging God to fix the chaos. Joel taught that this chaos is actually progress. Consciousness is cleaning house. Everything not built on spiritual truth must crumble, so what's real can emerge. The false marriage must end, so the true relationship can begin. The business based on struggle must fail, so the business based on grace can form. Sarah stayed with the practice. 6 months later, she looked back and saw that everything that fell apart needed to fall apart. The marriage that ended had been dead for years. The business that failed had drained her soul. The health crisis forced her to address patterns she'd been ignoring. Joel's teaching hadn't caused the chaos. It had revealed what was already there. Another obstacle Joel's students faced was the silence of God. You practice presence. You meditate. You recognize Christ consciousness. And nothing seems to happen. No voice, no vision, no dramatic spiritual experience. Just silence. The mind interprets this as failure or God's absence. Joel taught that the silence is actually the goal, not the problem. God doesn't speak in words because God isn't a person. God is consciousness itself. The silence you fear is actually the presence you seek. When thoughts quiet, what remains is pure awareness. That awareness is Christ consciousness. You keep waiting for something dramatic to happen, missing the fact that the transformation is occurring in the silence itself. Joel compared it to a seed growing underground. Nothing appears to be happening above the surface, but massive change is occurring in the invisible realm. Your consciousness is shifting, even when you can't perceive it. The external results come later, after the internal foundation has been established. Trust the silence. Rest in the silence. The silence is where true spiritual work happens. This requires patience that modern spirituality doesn't teach. You want instant results, immediate confirmation that you're doing it right. Joel discovered that real spiritual transformation takes time, not because God is slow, but because consciousness shifts gradually as false beliefs dissolve and truth becomes established. 3 months of practice is just the beginning. Joel practiced for 50 years and said he was still learning. The third major obstacle is doubt. You practice Christ consciousness and doubt creeps in. Maybe this is all delusion. Maybe Joel was wrong. Maybe you should return to traditional religion where at least you know what you're supposed to believe. Joel faced this doubt himself in his early years. He understood the temptation to abandon spiritual practice when results don't match expectations. Here's how Joel handled doubt. He didn't fight it or deny it. He recognized that doubt arises from the human mind, not from Christ consciousness. Consciousness itself never doubts because it simply is. The doubt is another thought passing through awareness. You can observe the doubt without being controlled by it. Let the doubt be present while you continue practicing presence. Over time, Joel noticed something remarkable. The more he practiced despite doubt, the less power doubt had. Not because he conquered it through willpower, but because consciousness was establishing itself as primary reality. Doubt still appeared occasionally, but it no longer determined his actions. He continued practicing presence whether doubt was present or absent. This is spiritual maturity. You don't wait until you feel certain to practice. You practice despite uncertainty, despite doubt, despite lack of external confirmation. Joel taught that consciousness develops through use, like a muscle. The more you practice recognizing Christ consciousness regardless of how you feel, the more established that consciousness becomes. Faith isn't believing hard enough. Faith is continuing to practice when belief wavers. The final obstacle Joel addressed was the problem of persistent negative patterns. You recognize Christ consciousness. You practice presence, yet the same problems keep appearing. The same relationship patterns, the same financial struggles, the same health issues. Your mind screams that the practice isn't working. Joel taught that these persistent patterns reveal deeper consciousness that needs addressing. Every external pattern reflects internal consciousness. If the pattern persists, there's a belief operating below your awareness that keeps creating it. Joel's approach was to sit in meditation and ask consciousness to reveal the hidden belief. Not asking God for answers, but letting your own awareness show you what you can't see. The answer always comes when you're truly ready to see it. Michael struggled with poverty consciousness for years despite practicing Joel's teaching. One day in meditation, the hidden belief surfaced. He believed spiritual people should be poor to prove they're not materialistic. This belief operated unconsciously, sabotaging every financial demonstration. Once he saw it, he could recognize it as false. Spiritual consciousness knows nothing of poverty. Within months, his finances transformed. This is deep work that requires brutal honesty. You can't heal what you won't acknowledge. Joel taught that every persistent problem is an invitation to discover false beliefs you don't know you're holding. The problem isn't punishment, it's teacher. As you bring these hidden beliefs into consciousness and recognize their unreality, the patterns lose power, not through effort, but through recognition of truth. If these obstacle-transforming insights are breaking through your spiritual barriers, like to support this revolutionary teaching, subscribe for advanced Christ consciousness practices, and comment, which obstacle are you ready to transform through Joel Goldsmith's wisdom? Joel taught advanced practitioners to carry Christ consciousness into daily activity, not just meditation. This is where theory becomes practical demonstration. You're in a business meeting and tension rises. Traditional response is to react, defend, or attack. Christ consciousness response is to silently recognize that only God is present here, not God watching the meeting, but God as the only consciousness actually operating. This takes practice. Your human personality wants to engage in the drama. Joel taught that you can function in the human world while remaining anchored in spiritual awareness. You speak when necessary, act when required, but you're not lost in the appearance of conflict. You're recognizing that beneath all human interaction, there's only one divine consciousness temporarily appearing as many personalities. Linda practiced this in her toxic workplace. Instead of quitting or fighting, she began silently recognizing Christ consciousness as the only presence. When her boss attacked her, she didn't take it personally because she recognized both of them as divine consciousness having a human experience. The external behavior didn't immediately change, but her inner peace became unshakable. Over 6 months, something remarkable happened. Either her boss softened significantly, or Linda was moved to a different department, or she was guided to a new job. Joel taught that when you hold spiritual consciousness steady, the external must eventually conform. You don't know how or when. You simply practice presence and trust that consciousness knows what needs to happen. Another advanced practice Joel taught was recognizing perfection in apparent imperfection. Someone is ill. Traditional response is to pray for healing. Joel's advanced teaching was to recognize that in spiritual consciousness, there is no illness to heal. The body's appearance doesn't determine spiritual reality. This doesn't mean ignoring medical care. It means recognizing truth while dealing with appearance. David's daughter was diagnosed with a serious condition. Every instinct said to panic, to beg God for intervention. Joel had taught David to practice presence even in crisis. David sat with his fear, acknowledged it, and then practiced recognizing his daughter's true spiritual identity as whole, complete, and perfect, not denying her symptoms, but refusing to accept them as ultimate reality. The treatment process was difficult. There were setbacks and scary moments, but David maintained spiritual consciousness throughout. He didn't make healing the goal. He made recognition of truth the practice. Whether the body healed or not, his daughter's spiritual identity remained forever perfect. This consciousness gave both of them peace that transcended circumstances. The body did heal, but that's not the point. Joel taught dozens of students whose bodies didn't heal but whose consciousness awakened to eternal life. Physical healing is wonderful when it happens. Consciousness awakening to its divine nature is the real transformation. When you practice this advanced recognition, you're no longer at the mercy of external circumstances. You've found the peace that passes understanding. Joel's most advanced teaching addressed the problem of evil. How do you practice Christ consciousness when facing genuine malice, violence, or cruelty? Traditional religion says evil is real and God will punish it. Joel taught something radically different. Evil has no power except the power you give it through belief. This isn't naive optimism. This is spiritual law. When Jesus said, "Resist not evil," he wasn't teaching passivity. He was revealing that evil is appearance without ultimate reality. The moment you resist it, you make it real in your consciousness. The moment you fight it, you empower it. Joel taught that the only way to overcome evil is to recognize its nothingness. Not that it doesn't appear to harm, but that it has no actual power in spiritual reality. This is terrifying to practice. Someone wrongs you severely. Your mind demands justice, revenge, or at minimum acknowledgement of the evil done. Joel taught that this response keeps you trapped in the consciousness that attracted the experience. The way through is recognizing that evil is simply good misunderstood, truth forgotten, love temporarily obscured by human confusion. As you practice this recognition, something extraordinary happens. Either the situation resolves in ways you couldn't have orchestrated, or you're removed from it, or you develop such inner peace that external circumstances lose their power to disturb you. Joel wasn't teaching you to accept abuse. He was showing you how to free yourself from evil's power through recognition of its unreality. The final advanced practice Joel taught was becoming a transparent consciousness. This means you're so established in Christ consciousness that you become a healing presence without doing anything. People feel peace around you. Situations resolve when you enter them, not because you're special, but because consciousness operating through you recognizes only spiritual reality. Joel reached this state after decades of practice. He would sit in a room and simply be present. People reported physical healings, emotional breakthroughs, spiritual awakenings. He wasn't doing anything to them. His consciousness was simply so clear of personal agenda that divine consciousness could operate unobstructed. This is the goal of all spiritual practice. Complete transparency to truth. You don't achieve this through effort. You achieve it through persistent recognition of what's already true. Every day, you practice presence. Every challenge, you recognize Christ consciousness. Every interaction, you see divine identity beneath human personality. Over years, not days or months, consciousness becomes so established that it operates automatically. This is what Jesus demonstrated. He wasn't born special. He achieved complete transparency to Christ consciousness through practice and recognition. Joel taught that this same achievement is available to you, not because you're better than others, but because consciousness itself is your true identity. As you practice these advanced tools, you're not becoming something new. You're recognizing what you've always been beneath the layers of false belief. After decades of teaching, Joel reflected on what he'd learned about transformation. The process isn't linear. You don't climb a ladder from unconsciousness to enlightenment. You have moments of profound recognition followed by periods of forgetting. The practice is returning to presence each time you realize you've left it. This is the spiritual journey, not arriving, but continuously returning. Some students experienced dramatic healings and life changes within months. Others practiced for years before seeing external results. Joel discovered that timing wasn't the issue. Depth of realization was what mattered. You could practice for decades with shallow understanding and see limited change. Or you could have one moment of profound recognition that transformed everything instantly. The key wasn't how long you practiced, but how deeply you recognized truth. One student had a single meditation where Christ consciousness became absolutely real, not as concept, but as experienced reality. Her life transformed within weeks. Another student practiced diligently for 5 years and finally had the recognition during a walk in nature. Suddenly, everything Joel taught clicked into place. Joel himself said his deepest recognitions came after 40 years of practice. He thought he understood Christ consciousness early on, but each decade revealed deeper layers. He remained humble, acknowledging he was still learning, still discovering new dimensions of spiritual truth. This humility kept him open to revelation. The moment you think you've arrived, you've stopped growing. Joel's teaching about Jesus ultimately comes down to this. Jesus wasn't God's only son. He was the first to fully demonstrate what divine sonship means. He came to show you what you are, not to be the only one who is it. Every miracle he performed was meant to wake you up to your own spiritual power. Every teaching he gave was instruction for your transformation. When you practice Christ consciousness, you're not worshiping Jesus. You're following his actual instruction. He said, "Learn of me, not worship me." He said, "You are the light of the world, not I am the only light." He said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you, not within me alone." The church changed his message because awakened people don't need institutions. This understanding restores Jesus to his rightful role, spiritual teacher and way shower, not distant deity requiring intermediaries. You have direct access to the same source he accessed. You have the same divine identity he recognized. You can demonstrate the same spiritual laws he demonstrated, not because you're special, but because consciousness itself is what you are. Joel spent his life proving this works. Thousands of students demonstrated healing, transformation, and spiritual awakening through his teaching. Not because Joel had special power, but because he accurately taught what Jesus actually meant. The truth was always there in the Gospels. It just got buried under layers of doctrine designed to keep you dependent and small. The practice doesn't end. Christ consciousness isn't a destination you reach and then coast. It's a living, breathing awareness you maintain moment by moment. Some days you feel clearly established in truth. Other days you forget completely and get lost in appearances. Joel taught that this is normal and expected. You're human, experiencing divine consciousness. The journey is eternal. What changes is your relationship with forgetting. Early on, you might forget for days or weeks before remembering to practice. As consciousness establishes, you notice forgetting sooner. Eventually, you might forget for only moments before presence returns. The goal isn't never forgetting. The goal is shortening the time between forgetting and remembering. Joel practiced until his death at age 73. Even then, he said he was still learning, still discovering new dimensions of Christ consciousness. This should encourage you. You're not trying to achieve perfection. You're practicing presence. Every moment you recognize truth, consciousness establishes more deeply. Every time you return to presence after forgetting, the return becomes easier. Your spiritual journey is unique. Your timing is your own. Your challenges are specifically designed for your awakening. Joel taught that everything in your experience is consciousness revealing itself. The pleasant and the painful, the easy and the difficult, all serve the same purpose, waking you up to what you've always been but temporarily forgot. Here's what Joel ultimately discovered after 50 years of practice and teaching. The entire spiritual journey is about recognizing what's already true. You're not becoming divine. You're recognizing divinity as your nature. You're not earning God's love. You're accepting that love is what you are. You're not acquiring Christ consciousness. You're removing the beliefs that obscure your awareness of it. This truth changes everything about how you live. Prayer becomes recognition instead of petition. Challenges become opportunities for deeper realization instead of problems to solve. Other people become mirrors showing you aspects of consciousness instead of separate individuals to judge or control. Every moment becomes sacred because every moment is consciousness experiencing itself. The relationship with Jesus transforms completely. He's no longer the distant savior you beg for help. He's the elder brother who showed you the way home. His life demonstrated what's possible when human consciousness fully recognizes its divine identity. His teaching provides the roadmap for your own awakening. His love supports you as you walk the path he walked. Joel's legacy is this. He restored Jesus' original teaching from beneath 2,000 years of religious distortion. He proved that ordinary people can experience extraordinary spiritual transformation through recognizing Christ consciousness. He demonstrated that healing, peace, and abundance flow naturally when consciousness aligns with spiritual truth. The practice works. The question is, will you practice? If your spiritual understanding of Jesus and your divine nature has been revolutionized by these Joel Goldsmith revelations, like this video to help others discover this hidden truth, subscribe for more mystical Christianity teachings that transform lives, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new consciousness and spiritual path. Most people spend their entire lives desperately seeking God outside themselves, praying to distant deities, studying ancient texts, and visiting holy places. They never realize the profound mystical truth that Joel Goldsmith discovered through decades of direct spiritual experience and contemplation. The Christ you've been searching for in churches, books, temples, and through countless teachers has never actually left you for even a single moment. It's not a historical figure who lived 2,000 years ago, nor some distant divine being sitting on a heavenly throne judging your every thought and action. This isn't mere religious sentiment, wishful thinking, or New Age philosophy. This is the fundamental reality of your very being that transforms absolutely everything about your life experience when it becomes your lived understanding rather than just intellectual knowledge. The Christ is the divine consciousness that constitutes your very essence, your true spiritual identity that exists before and beyond all thoughts, emotions, circumstances, conditions, or any temporary human experiences that seem to define you. Joel Goldsmith discovered this revolutionary truth not through years of theological study in seminaries or through reading countless spiritual books, but through profound, direct mystical experience that came to him during deep states of spiritual contemplation and communion with divine consciousness. After spending years seeking God through traditional religious channels and finding only temporary satisfaction, he experienced a moment of pure recognition that changed everything. In that instant, he realized that the Christ had never been separate from him, not even for a millisecond. The moment this understanding dawned in his consciousness, his entire life experience underwent complete transformation. Chronic illnesses that had plagued him for years disappeared without medical intervention. Financial lack that had created constant worry simply vanished as abundance began flowing naturally. But here's what most people completely miss about Joel's profound teaching. Understanding that Christ lives within you isn't about believing something with your rational mind or accepting it as religious doctrine that you must have faith in despite lack of evidence. This recognition is about discovering the divine consciousness that's actually reading these very words right now, the awareness that exists behind all your thoughts, emotions, and sensory experiences. The pure consciousness that observes your mental activity is Christ consciousness itself expressing as your individual being. When you truly understand that Christ lives in you, something absolutely miraculous happens to your entire relationship with problems, challenges, difficulties, and all the circumstances that have been causing you stress, worry, fear, and frustration throughout your human experience. Instead of fighting against circumstances or desperately trying to change conditions through willpower, manipulation, or endless effort, you begin to recognize that the divine consciousness within you is already completely whole, perfect, and lacking absolutely nothing. This doesn't mean that problems disappear instantly like magic, but your fundamental relationship to them transforms so completely that even the same exact circumstances feel entirely different when experienced from this recognition of your true spiritual identity. You begin to experience what Joel called divine indifference, which is not callousness or lack of caring about human suffering, but rather a profound inner peace that remains completely unshaken regardless of whatever outer appearances may be presenting themselves in your experience. Fear begins losing its grip on your consciousness because you finally know your true identity as spiritual being, rather than identifying yourself as vulnerable human personality subject to all the random forces and circumstances that seem to control ordinary human experience. Most people experience brief glimpses of this profound truth during deep meditation, prayer, or moments of natural beauty. But then they lose this recognition completely when faced with challenging situations that trigger old patterns of fearful thinking and reactive emotions. The secret that Joel discovered and taught is learning to maintain this recognition of your divine nature consistently throughout all daily life activities, seeing every single situation as a perfect opportunity to express and demonstrate your inherent spiritual nature rather than reacting from limited human personality. Here's the absolutely revolutionary aspect that separates Joel's teaching from virtually all conventional spirituality and religious approaches. You don't need to become spiritual, achieve enlightenment, earn God's love, or attain some special state that you currently lack through years of discipline and effort. You simply need to recognize and acknowledge what you already are in this very moment. The Christ consciousness isn't something you must develop, cultivate, or achieve through spiritual practices. It's something you discover has always been fully present as your true identity. This recognition completely transforms your entire approach to living. Instead of constantly trying to get something from God through prayer, you begin naturally expressing as God through every thought, word, and action that flows from your recognition of your divine nature. Instead of seeking healing from some external source, you recognize your inherent wholeness that has never actually been damaged or diminished by any appearance of illness or limitation. Instead of pursuing abundance, you express from the infinite supply that exists within your own consciousness. When this understanding becomes your lived reality, rather than just an interesting concept, people around you begin experiencing healing and transformation simply by being in your presence, without you doing anything special or trying to help them in any way whatsoever. This is exactly how Joel was able to facilitate healing for thousands of people throughout his ministry, without ever claiming to heal anyone or taking credit for any of the miraculous transformations that occurred in people's lives through contact with his consciousness. He simply remained consistently conscious of spiritual truth about himself and others, creating an atmosphere where people could recognize their own divine nature and experience the natural healing that flows from that recognition of their true spiritual identity. Let me share with you some specific examples of how this recognition has transformed real people's lives in practical, measurable ways that demonstrate the power of understanding that Christ lives in you as your actual identity rather than as religious belief. Sarah had suffered from chronic anxiety disorder for 15 long years, trying every available therapy, medication, breathing technique, cognitive behavioral approach, and healing modality she could find, spending thousands of dollars seeking relief from the constant worry and fear that dominated her daily experience. When she first encountered Joel's teaching about Christ consciousness being her true identity, she initially dismissed it as impractical religious platitudes that couldn't possibly help with her very real psychological and physical symptoms that were seriously impacting her ability to function normally. But something deep within her consciousness recognized the ring of truth in these words. She began practicing simply acknowledging the divine presence within her throughout each day, especially during moments when anxiety was particularly intense and overwhelming. Instead of fighting the anxiety or trying to make it go away through various techniques, she would silently recognize her true spiritual identity as divine consciousness temporarily experiencing human emotions, which created space between her true self and the temporary emotional weather. Within just a few weeks, something fundamental began shifting in Sarah's entire experience. The anxiety didn't disappear overnight like magic, but her relationship to it changed so completely that the same feelings no longer had the power to disturb her inner peace and stability. She began experiencing a deep, unshakable peace underlying all surface emotions, like discovering still water beneath turbulent waves. The chronic muscle tension that had plagued her for years started releasing naturally without any physical therapy or relaxation techniques. By the third month of consistent practice, people began commenting on her presence. There was a quality of stillness, peace, and quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from her without any effort on her part, creating a calming effect on everyone around her. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment. What healing journey resonated most with you? Michael discovered this truth through severe financial crisis that threatened to destroy everything he had worked for throughout his adult life. After his business failed and debts mounted to overwhelming proportions, he felt completely desperate and abandoned by God, questioning everything he had believed about spiritual principles. A close friend introduced him to Joel Goldsmith's teachings about divine sonship and infinite supply, but Michael struggled to see how abstract spiritual concepts could possibly solve his very concrete practical problems like mortgage payments and business obligations. The breakthrough came when he completely stopped trying to use spiritual truth as a technique to fix his dire financial situation, and instead began living from the recognition of his spiritual identity as consciousness, in which infinite supply already exists as present reality. He started each day acknowledging the unlimited abundance within his own consciousness, not as a method for attracting money or manipulating circumstances, but a simple recognition of what was already true about his spiritual nature regardless of bank account balances. New opportunities began appearing in the most unexpected ways. Former clients he hadn't heard from in years contacted him with profitable projects. Investment opportunities surfaced through casual conversations that led to significant returns he never could have planned or anticipated. But far more importantly than the improved financial circumstances, Michael's entire relationship to security and abundance underwent complete transformation. He no longer lived in constant fear and worry about money, because he finally understood that his true source was the infinite consciousness within him. Within 8 months, not only had his financial situation completely turned around with all debts paid and savings restored, but he had discovered a level of prosperity consciousness that continues expressing abundantly in his life many years later. The real miracle wasn't the money, but the recognition that he had never actually been separate from his source of supply, which is the infinite creative intelligence that expresses as his individual consciousness and attracts everything needed for abundant living. Then there's Margaret's profound healing journey that demonstrates the power of recognizing Christ consciousness as actual identity. Doctors had given her only 6 months to live due to advanced cancer that had spread throughout her body and wasn't responding to conventional medical treatments. Traditional chemotherapy and radiation had failed to slow the progression of her condition, and she felt hopeless, angry, and terrified about leaving her young children without a mother. When someone suggested that Christ consciousness was her true identity, she initially felt furious that anyone would offer spiritual platitudes during such a medical crisis. But in her darkest moment of despair, something deep inside her consciousness was willing to consider that there might be a truth about her identity that existed beyond medical diagnoses and prognostic statistics based on statistical averages of similar cases. She began spending time each day not praying desperately for healing or trying to bargain with God, but simply resting in the quiet recognition of her spiritual wholeness that existed prior to any physical condition or medical label that attempted to define her. The shift in Margaret's consciousness began very subtly. Instead of identifying herself as a person with cancer who might die, she started recognizing herself as eternal spiritual consciousness, temporarily experiencing physical challenges that were not her true identity. This wasn't denial of the medical condition or refusal to continue appropriate treatment, but rather recognition of her deeper identity that remained whole and perfect, regardless of what appeared to be happening to her physical form. which she now understood as temporary expression rather than her actual self. Her next series of medical tests showed improvement that her oncologist described as highly unusual, given the advanced stage and aggressive nature of her particular type of cancer. The tumor markers that had been steadily rising began dropping significantly without explanation. 6 months later, all traces of cancer had completely disappeared from her body, verified by multiple tests and scans. But Margaret consistently insists that the real healing wasn't physical. It was the recognition of who she truly was beyond any temporary physical experience. These aren't isolated incidents, special cases, or rare exceptions that only happen to particularly spiritual people. When you truly understand that Christ lives in you as your actual identity, these kinds of transformations become natural expressions of your spiritual nature rather than miraculous exceptions to normal life. The key is moving completely beyond intellectual understanding or emotional belief to lived recognition of your divine nature that remains constant regardless of changing circumstances, emotions, thoughts, or any temporary experiences that come and go in your human awareness. Joel taught that miracles aren't violations of natural law or supernatural interventions that override normal reality, but rather expressions of spiritual law operating at a higher level than material appearances that most people accept as ultimate reality. When you truly know yourself as spiritual consciousness, rather than limited human personality, you naturally begin expressing the inherent qualities of that consciousness: wholeness, abundance, love, peace, wisdom, and creative power that transforms every area of your life experience. Now let's explore specific practical techniques that help anchor this recognition in your daily experience, so it becomes your lived reality rather than just inspiring concepts that you think about occasionally during quiet moments, but forget when faced with challenging circumstances. The first technique Joel taught was maintaining what he called the listening attitude throughout your day. This isn't trying to hear God speak to you in words or waiting for mystical experiences, but maintaining gentle awareness of the divine presence within your consciousness during all activities. Start by taking brief moments throughout your day to simply pause and silently acknowledge, the Christ that I am is present right now. Don't try to feel anything special or achieve any particular spiritual state. Simply recognize this truth about your identity in this present moment. This practice gradually shifts your center of identity from personality, circumstances, emotions, and thoughts to the changeless divine consciousness within you, allowing you to experience what Joel called living by grace, where divine wisdom guides decisions naturally. The second practical technique involves what Joel termed knowing the truth about others in every interaction and relationship. When you encounter someone experiencing challenges, difficulties, illness, or any form of limitation, instead of sympathizing with their problems, silently recognize their spiritual identity. See them as divine consciousness appearing in human form, rather than identifying them with their temporary circumstances, personality patterns, or the problems they may be experiencing. This recognition has profound effects on all your relationships and interactions. People begin sensing something different in your presence, a quality of acceptance and recognition that allows their own divine nature to surface naturally. Many report feeling mysteriously peaceful, inspired, or clear about solutions after being with someone who practices this recognition consistently. Remember, you're not trying to change anyone, fix their problems, or convince them of spiritual truth. You're simply maintaining awareness of what they truly are, regardless of appearances, which creates an atmosphere where healing and transformation can occur naturally through their own recognition. The third technique Joel taught involves handling challenging emotions through spiritual recognition rather than suppression, analysis, or resistance. When anger, fear, sadness, or any difficult emotion arises in your experience, instead of fighting it or trying to understand why it's happening, recognize your true identity. Acknowledge silently, I'm experiencing anger right now, but anger is not what I am. I am the divine consciousness observing this temporary emotional weather pattern. This creates healthy space between your true identity and passing emotional experiences. You're not denying or suppressing the emotion, but recognizing that your essential nature remains untouched by any temporary feeling state. This allows emotions to move through your experience naturally without becoming stuck or defining your identity and self-concept. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, like to support this content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices, and comment, which obstacle are you ready to transform now? This approach transforms your relationship to all human experiences completely. You begin living as the conscious observer of your life, rather than the victim of circumstances, maintaining inner peace and clarity, regardless of what may be happening around you or within your human personality experience. The fourth technique involves practicing what Joel called divine indifference when facing challenging situations. This means maintaining recognition of spiritual truth regardless of appearances, while still taking appropriate practical action when needed in human affairs. For example, if facing financial pressure, you might acknowledge, "I'm experiencing concern about money in my human awareness, and I simultaneously recognize my infinite spiritual nature that lacks nothing and has access to unlimited creative resources and intelligence." This isn't denying the human experience or pretending problems don't exist, but maintaining awareness of your deeper identity throughout any challenge, which allows solutions to emerge from wisdom rather than fear, and creates space for practical guidance to appear naturally. Let's address the most common obstacles that people encounter when attempting to apply these teachings in their daily lives. The first major challenge is what Joel called metaphysical malpractice, which means using spiritual truth as a technique to get what your human personality wants rather than living from recognition of what you actually are. When you try to use the recognition of Christ within you as a method for manifesting desires, solving problems, or achieving goals, you're still operating from the consciousness of lack that believes you need something you don't currently have, which actually reinforces the very limitation you're trying to overcome. This approach usually leads to frustration and disappointment, because you're attempting to use truth rather than being truth. You're treating spiritual principles like tools for getting something, rather than recognizing them as descriptions of your actual nature and identity. The solution is shifting from using these teachings to accomplish things to living from them as expressions of what you are. Instead of recognizing Christ within in order to heal or prosper, recognize Christ within because it's simply the truth of your being, regardless of circumstances. The second major obstacle is having intellectual understanding without heart recognition. Many people can explain these concepts perfectly and even teach them to others, but they haven't actually experienced the transformative recognition that Joel was pointing toward in his writings and talks. They know about divine sonship, Christ consciousness, and spiritual identity, but this knowledge remains mental information rather than lived realization. There's still a sense of separation between themselves and the truth they're studying, as if spiritual consciousness is something they need to attain rather than what they are. This gap between knowing and being closes through consistent practice, but not the kind of effortful spiritual discipline that most people expect. It's not about doing more meditation, reading more books, or attending more classes, though these activities can be supportive. The recognition deepens through consistently returning to acknowledgement of your true identity throughout ordinary daily activities like cooking, working, driving, and having conversations. The breakthrough often comes in the most unexpected moments when you're not trying to be spiritual at all. The third obstacle is expecting instant dramatic results and becoming discouraged when transformation doesn't happen according to your human timeline and expectations. Joel emphasized throughout his teaching that spiritual realization often works quite differently than human planning and goal achievement. Some people do experience immediate dramatic changes in their circumstances and experience, while others notice subtle shifts unfolding gradually over weeks, months, or even years. The timing of outer demonstration doesn't reflect the validity of your recognition or your spiritual progress. The key is maintaining recognition of truth regardless of the speed of outer changes in your circumstances. Your spiritual identity and the reality of Christ consciousness within you aren't dependent on how quickly your experience transforms or how dramatically conditions improve. Trust the process of recognition while remaining committed to living from awareness of what you are rather than judging your spiritual progress based on material results. Often the most profound and lasting transformations happen gradually, allowing your consciousness time to integrate new levels of understanding. The fourth major obstacle is attempting to maintain this recognition through willpower, mental effort, or spiritual ambition. Joel taught clearly that spiritual consciousness is your natural state, not something you achieve through struggle, force, or determination to be spiritual all the time. Forced attempts to stay conscious or maintain awareness through effort usually create mental tension and spiritual strain rather than the natural recognition of what you are. This approach turns spiritual recognition into another form of work that exhausts rather than refreshes your consciousness. The solution is what Joel called effortless awareness, which means simply allowing yourself to remember your spiritual identity when you remember, without guilt, self-criticism, or struggle when you temporarily forget and get caught up in human personality reactions and concerns. Like learning to play a musical instrument, consistent, gentle practice with patience and self-compassion is much more effective than forced, intensive effort that creates tension. Allow your recognition of Christ within to develop organically through daily acknowledgement rather than spiritual perfectionism. Now let's explore advanced integration of this recognition in daily life and relationships. When you begin consistently living from the awareness that Christ lives in you as your actual identity, every aspect of your experience starts transforming in ways that feel natural rather than forced or artificial. Your approach to work becomes an expression of your divine nature, rather than a struggle for survival, security, or personal achievement. Business decisions begin flowing from inner wisdom and genuine service rather than fear, competition, or ego ambition that characterizes most commercial activity. You find yourself naturally attracted to opportunities and relationships that align with your spiritual values and support your highest expression, while situations that compromise your integrity or drain your energy naturally fall away without effort or dramatic confrontation. Your presence in meetings, social gatherings, and all interactions takes on a quality that others notice and appreciate, even if they can't articulate what feels different about being around you. People begin seeking your perspective and input for reasons beyond your professional expertise. All relationships undergo profound transformation when you consistently recognize the divine nature in yourself and others, rather than relating to people based on their personality patterns, past behavior, or current circumstances that seem to define their identity. This doesn't mean ignoring practical considerations, avoiding appropriate boundaries, or being naive about human behavior. Rather, you maintain awareness of spiritual truth about people while handling human interactions with wisdom, discernment, and practical intelligence. This combination of spiritual recognition and human wisdom creates space for others to express their highest qualities naturally. When you stop reacting to people's limited expressions and consistently see their divine nature, they often begin expressing from that higher level of their being. Many people report that family relationships that had been tense, conflicted, or distant for years begin healing without direct discussion of past problems or attempts to resolve old issues through conversation, therapy, or family meetings that often create more tension than resolution. Health and vitality take on entirely new dimensions when you live from consistent recognition of your spiritual identity rather than identifying primarily as a physical body that happens to have consciousness. This shift naturally supports physical well-being in remarkable ways. You begin making choices about food, exercise, rest, and self-care from inner wisdom rather than external rules, diet programs, or fear-based medical advice that treats the body as a machine that needs to be controlled and managed through willpower and discipline. Your physical form starts feeling more like a trusted vehicle for expressing your spiritual nature rather than a source of constant concern, limitation, or potential problems that might develop as you age. The body responds positively to being recognized as perfect expression of divine consciousness. If your spiritual understanding expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video, subscribe for more transformative teachings, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new path.
Всего 2 дня. Это все, что нужно. Всего 2 утра, когда ты будешь повторять одну сильную аффирмацию. И ты начнешь чувствовать, как перемены волной проходят через твое тело, твой разум, твою энергию. 2 дня могут показаться мелочью, но, моя хорошая, никогда не стоит недооценивать силу сосредоточенного намерения в сочетании с правдой о твоей собственной ценности. Когда ты искренне посвящаешь себя даже короткой практике, Ты сажаешь семена, которые могут расцвести и изменить всю твою жизнь. Аффирмация, которую я хочу, чтобы ты прочувствовала, звучит так: «Я достойна всего, чего желаю, и это уже на пути ко мне». Произнеси ее, ощути ее, позволь ей впитаться в твое сердце так же естественно, как дыхание. Видишь ли, большинство людей неправильно понимают закон притяжения. Они верят, что нужно просить, умолять или выпрашивать у Вселенной, пока что-то не произойдет. Но Вселенная не отвечает на отчаяние, она отвечает на энергию, она отвечает на веру, которая стоит за словами. Если ты шепчешь «я хочу этого», но в глубине души уверена «я этого не заслуживаю», Вселенная отражает твою глубинную вибрацию, а не поверхностное желание. Вот почему твое ощущение собственной ценности – это ключ. Я говорила это много раз. Единственное, что стоит между тобой и благами, которых ты желаешь, это вера в то, что ты их недостойна. И сегодня вечером, или завтра утром, или когда бы ты ни начала эту практику, я хочу, чтобы ты помнила эту истину. Достоинство – это не то, что ты зарабатываешь, это не то, что ты покупаешь, это не то, что дается тебе другими, это твое право по рождению. В тот миг, когда ты пришла в этот мир, ты уже была достойна любви, радости, изобилия и покоя. Ничто из того, что ты сделала или не сделала, никогда этого не отменяло. Ничто в твоем прошлом не может отнять у тебя твою ценность. А теперь вот как ты будешь практиковать. Каждое утро в течение следующих 2 дней подходи к зеркалу, посмотри в свои глаза, мягко положи руку на сердце и произнеси медленно, отчетливо, со всей любовью, которую сможешь собрать: «Я достойна. Я достойна всего, чего желаю, и это уже на пути ко мне». Сначала ты можешь почувствовать сопротивление. Внутри могут подняться старые голоса, говорящие: «Нет, это не так. Кто ты такая, чтобы этого заслуживать? Другие могут это иметь, но не ты». Не борись с этими голосами. Просто признай их, а затем снова сделай свой выбор. Все равно произнеси аффирмацию. Именно повторение смягчает старые убеждения. Именно постоянство перепрограммирует подсознание. Помни, моя хорошая, подсознание не меняется от одного громкого заявления. Оно меняется от мягкого, любящего повторения. Как вода точит камень, так и твои ежедневные слова прокладывают новый путь в твоем внутреннем мире. И даже через 2 дня ты начнешь замечать перемены. Ты будешь стоять прямее, дышать глубже, чувствовать себя легче. Возможности появятся там, где раньше ты видела только стены. Это не волшебство. Это естественный результат того, что твоя внутренняя правда совпала с твоими словами. Позволь мне напомнить, почему это работает. Каждая твоя мысль – это как команда. Каждое слово, которое ты говоришь, это как семя. Когда ты говоришь «я достойна», ты не притворяешься, ты вспоминаешь. Ты произносишь истину, которая всегда была твоей. И когда ты говоришь это снова и снова, утро за утром, твоя энергия меняется, твоя вибрация повышается, и Вселенная, как огромное зеркало, отражает тебе эту ценность в виде людей, возможностей, ресурсов и благословений. Подумай об этом. Когда ты веришь, что недостойно, ты отталкиваешь хорошее, даже не осознавая этого. Ты саботируешь возможности, ты соглашаешься на меньшее. ты закрываешь свое сердце для любви. Но когда ты знаешь, что достойно, ты начинаешь говорить жизни «да». Ты начинаешь принимать хорошее, а не сомневаться в нем. Ты начинаешь позволять, а не сопротивляться. И в этом позволении жизнь начинает течь свободно. Так много людей спрашивают меня: «Луиза, почему мои аффирмации не работают?» И я отвечаю им: потому что аффирмация – это просто слова, пока ты в них не поверишь. Вот почему эта двухдневная практика так сильна. В течение 2 дней ты не просто повторяешь слова, ты учишь свой ум, свое тело, свое сердце тому, что достоинство – это твоя реальность. Ты создаешь новую внутреннюю атмосферу, в которой изобилие кажется естественным, любовь – безопасной, а покой – возможным. А теперь давай пойдем глубже. Когда ты говоришь «я достойна всего, чего желаю, и это уже на пути ко мне», обрати внимание на вторую часть. Это уже на пути. Это жизненно важно, потому что энергия ожидания, тоски и погони держит тебя в состоянии нехватки. Но энергия позволения, принятия и доверия говорит: «Я знаю, что это придет. Мне не нужно за этим гнаться. Мне не нужно это форсировать. Я могу расслабиться в знании, что все уже происходит. Одно только это изменение может все перевернуть. Я приглашаю тебя представить, каким бы был твой день, если бы ты проснулась с уверенностью, что все, чего ты желаешь, уже в пути. Ты бы меньше переживала, больше улыбалась. Твоя походка стала бы легче. Вот к чему приглашает тебя эта аффирмация. Это не просто слова, это способ быть. Так что вот твое задание на 2 утра. Встань перед зеркалом, рука на сердце, глаза открыты, душа пробуждена. Произнеси слова: «Я достойна всего, чего желаю, и это уже на пути ко мне». Скажи это 3 раза, скажи это 10 раз. Говори, пока не почувствуешь, как в груди поднимается мягкое тепло, а затем пронеси это чувство с собой через весь день. Каждый раз, когда зашепчет сомнение, вернись к этим словам. Каждый раз, когда закричит страх, вернись к этим словам. Каждый раз, когда почувствуешь себя маленькой, вернись к этим словам. Я обещаю тебе, через 2 дня ты почувствуешь сдвиг. Ты можешь заметить спокойствие там, где раньше было напряжение. Ты можешь заметить ясность там, где раньше была путаница. Ты можешь заметить маленькие совпадения. Кто-то позвонит в нужный момент, появится неожиданная возможность, нахлынет волна покоя. Не отмахивайся от этого, считая случайностью. Это доказательство того, что Вселенная слушает, что твоя энергия настраивается, что твое достоинство притягивает то, что всегда было предназначено для тебя. Моя дорогая, тебе не нужно сражаться за свои благословения. Тебе не нужно гнаться за своими мечтами до изнеможения. Тебе не нужно вымаливать любовь, деньги или покой. Ты достойна, ты заслуживаешь, тебя достаточно. И когда ты это вспоминаешь, когда ты это произносишь, когда ты этим живешь, Вселенная поднимается, чтобы встретить тебя. А теперь давай погрузимся еще глубже в это путешествие пробуждения, потому что недостаточно просто знать слова. Мы должны также знать, как их использовать. Так многие из нас говорят о своих желаниях, как будто они где-то далеко, как будто они всегда где-то в будущем, но никогда не здесь. Мы говорим: «У меня будет дом, о котором я мечтаю. Я найду любовь. Я создам изобилие». Но видишь, что происходит, когда мы так говорим? Мы отодвигаем то хорошее, по которому тоскуем, на завтра, на следующую неделю, на когда-нибудь. А когда-нибудь, моя хорошая, никогда не наступает. Я хочу, чтобы ты это по-настоящему услышала. Твое подсознание понимает только настоящий момент. Оно не работает с когда-нибудь. Оно не отвечает на «может быть». Оно отвечает на сейчас. Когда ты говоришь в настоящем времени, ты не притворяешься. Ты сажаешь семена. Ты даешь своему подсознанию прямое указание. И Вселенная немедленно откликается на это указание. Вот почему мы переходим от «у меня будет» к «у меня есть», от «однажды» к «сегодня». Подумай об этом так. Если бы ты пришла в ресторан и сказала официанту: «Когда-нибудь я бы хотела поесть», он не сможет тебе ничего принести. Ты будешь сидеть голодный. Но если ты четко скажешь: «Я готова к еде, и вот чего я желаю», кухня начнет готовить. Именно так работает Вселенная. Кухня мироздания не может приготовить то, что ты не заказала. Ясно? Теперь я знаю, что у многих из вас, когда вы говорите «у меня есть», внутри может возникнуть голос, который спорит: «Но у меня этого еще нет. Разве это не обман?» Нет, моя хорошая, это не обман. Это сонастройка. Ты сонастраиваешь свои внутренние слова с высшей истиной Вселенной. Потому что в мире энергии, в поле потенциала, то, чего ты желаешь, уже здесь. Твои слова просто позволяют этому перейти из возможности в реальность. Позволь мне привести пример. Вместо того, чтобы говорить «однажды я буду здорова», ты говоришь «я здорова». Каждая клетка моего тела вибрирует жизненной силой. Когда ты это произносишь, твое тело слушает, твои клетки откликаются. Исцеление начинается сейчас, а не потом. Вместо того, чтобы говорить «я буду богатой, когда буду усерднее работать», ты говоришь «я изобильна, деньги текут ко мне с легкостью». И внезапно твоя энергия меняется с напряжения на открытость. Возможности приходят не потому, что ты их выталкиваешь, а потому, что ты с ними сонастроена. Я не могу не подчеркнуть это снова и снова. Аффирмации в настоящем времени – это не игра воображения, это инструмент творения. Каждый раз, когда ты заявляешь «я есть», ты призываешь саму жизнь встать на твою сторону. Чем больше ты практикуешь, тем естественнее это ощущается, пока однажды ты не поймешь, что жизнь, о которой ты говорила с верой, стала жизнью, которую ты проживаешь в реальности. А теперь давай перейдем к еще более мощной практике – искусству визуализации в сочетании с благодарностью. Потому что одни слова могут быть сухими, если они не наполнены чувством. Визуализация – это кисть, благодарность – это краски, а твоя аффирмация – холст. Вместе они создают шедевр. Закрой глаза на мгновение. Представь себя уже живущей своей мечтой. Увидь себя в том новом доме. Заметь детали, цвет стен, ощущение, когда идешь босиком по полу, запах свежих цветов на кухне. Или представь себя в прекрасном здравии. Почувствуй энергию в своем теле, легкость в дыхании, бодрость в шаге. Может быть, ты представляешь себя окруженной любовью, в объятиях, которые тебя ценят, чувствуя, как воздух наполняется смехом. Каким бы ни было твое желание, позволь этому образу возникнуть в твоем уме. А теперь самый важный шаг. Почувствуй благодарность так, словно это уже случилось. Благодарность – это тот самый ток, который включает аффирмацию. Без благодарности слова – это просто звук. С благодарностью они становятся силой. Благодарность говорит Вселенной: это реально, это мое, благодарю. И Вселенная отвечает громким «да». Когда ты визуализируешь, не просто смотри на картинку, чувствуй. Пусть твое сердце переполняется, пусть твоя улыбка станет шире, пусть твое тело расслабится в радости, потому что подсознание не знает разницы между тем, что ярко воображаемо, и тем, что реально физически. Оно просто получает эмоциональный сигнал и начинает создавать обстоятельства, которые ему соответствуют. Вот почему благодарность – это секретный ингредиент. Благодарность говорит «свершилось». Благодарность говорит «я доверяю». Благодарность говорит «я уже принимаю». Так что вот твоя практика. Каждое утро, после того, как ты произнесешь свою аффирмацию в настоящем времени, закрой глаза и удели 1 минуту, всего 1, чтобы представить, что все уже произошло. Дыша, шепчи тихонько: «Благодарю, благодарю, благодарю». Заметь, как меняется твое тело. Заметь, как поднимается настроение. Заметь, как утихает страх. Вот как ты создаешь сонастройку. Через слова, через образы, через благодарность. Я часто говорю, то, на чем мы сосредотачиваемся, растет. То, о чем мы думаем, становится нашей жизнью. Если ты сосредотачиваешься на нехватке, ты получаешь еще больше нехватки. Если ты сосредотачиваешься на страхе, ты чувствуешь еще больше страха. Но если ты сосредотачиваешься на благодарности, жизнь дает тебе еще больше поводов для благодарности. Если ты сосредотачиваешься на изобилии, изобилие умножается. Если ты сосредотачиваешься на любви, любовь окружает тебя. Формула так проста, и все же ее так часто упускают из виду, потому что мы гонимся за усилиями, а не за энергией. Позволь мне напомнить тебе, дорогая, Вселенная не требует, чтобы ты работала усерднее, давила сильнее или доказывала свою ценность. Вселенная требует лишь, чтобы ты сонастроила свой внутренний мир с вибрацией того, что ты хочешь пережить. Слова в настоящем времени в сочетании с благодарностью визуализации – это самый прямой способ создать эту сонастройку. Так что сегодня вечером, перед тем, как закрыть глаза, или завтра утром, перед тем, как начать свой день, попробуй вот что. Положи руку на сердце и заяви: «Я достойна», «Я изобильна», «Я любима». Затем закрой глаза и представь одну прекрасную сцену, где твое желание исполнилось. Почувствуй это, улыбнись этому, прошепчи «благодарю». Сделай это на следующий день, а потом еще раз, и скоро ты обнаружишь, что твой внешний мир начал перестраиваться, чтобы соответствовать внутреннему образу, который ты выбрала. Потому что правда в том, что жизнь всегда слушает, жизнь всегда отражает, жизнь всегда отвечает. Вопрос в том, что ты говоришь, что ты чувствуешь, что ты представляешь. Выбирай настоящее время, выбирай благодарность, выбирай любовь и смотри, как быстро Вселенная скажет тебе «да». Позволь мне спросить тебя кое о чем, моя прекрасная подруга. Ты когда-нибудь замечала, как меняется атмосфера в комнате, когда один человек входит с радостью, а другой, неся в себе гнев или страх. Тебе даже не нужно слышать их слов, тебе не нужны объяснения. Ты это чувствуешь. Это, дорогая моя, и есть энергия. И именно поэтому я хочу поделиться с тобой следующей мощной истиной. Когда ты меняешь свою энергию, ты меняешь свою жизнь. Не внешнее меняется первым, меняешься ты. А когда меняешься ты, вся Вселенная перестраивается, чтобы встретить тебя. Энергия — это общение, это твой самый истинный язык. Задолго до того, как слова слетят с твоих губ, твоя энергия уже все сказала. Когда ты практикуешь аффирмации, когда ты визуализируешь, когда ты позволяешь благодарности подниматься в твоем сердце, ты транслируешь определенную частоту. И эту частоту слышит Вселенная. Вселенная не отвечает на твои тревоги, мольбы или суетливую болтовню в уме. Она отвечает на вибрацию, которая лежит в их основе. Вселенная отвечает не на то, о чем ты просишь. Она отвечает на то, кем ты являешься. Представь на мгновение, что ты радиостанция. Если ты настроишься на частоту страха, все, что ты сможешь услышать, это помехи, беспокойство, ограничения, и жизнь будет вторить этому. Но если ты переключишь свой приемник на любовь, на доверие, на радость, внезапно музыка станет чистой, возможности откроются, поток вернется. Тебе не нужно бороться за сигнал, тебе просто нужно настроиться. Я часто говорю, когда я меняю свои мысли, я меняю свою жизнь. И я повторяю это снова и снова, потому что это правда. Каждый раз, когда ты повторяешь аффирмацию, каждый раз, когда ты чувствуешь ее в своем теле, ты меняешь свою энергию. И это изменение не маленькое, оно не невидимо, оно мощное, оно мгновенное. Иногда тебе даже не нужно ждать внешних перемен. Ты чувствуешь себя легче, спокойнее, безопаснее, прямо здесь и сейчас. И это чувство – доказательство того, что твоя вибрация изменилась. Но вот в чем прелесть. Энергия притягивает подобную себе энергию. Когда ты пребываешь в покое, ты притягиваешь больше покоя. Когда ты идешь с благодарностью, жизнь дает тебе больше поводов для благодарности. Когда ты излучаешь изобилие, возможности и ресурсы словно появляются из ниоткуда. Это не магия, это резонанс, это Вселенная, отражающая твое собственное внутреннее состояние, как зеркало. Так давай сделаем это практичным. В следующий раз, когда почувствуешь тревогу, остановись и подыши. Положи руку на сердце и прошепчи: «Я в безопасности, я любима, меня поддерживают». Закрой глаза и представь один прекрасный образ твоего желания, уже исполнившегося. Почувствуй это в своем теле. Улыбнись, как будто это уже произошло. Замечаешь сдвиг внутри себя? Это новая частота, это новая трансляция. И в тот момент, когда ты это чувствуешь, ты уже посылаешь сигнал вовне. А теперь перейдем к последнему уроку. Потому что именно здесь жизнь становится захватывающей. Когда твоя энергия меняется, начинают приходить возможности. Люди называют это удачей. Они называют это совпадением. Они называют это чудом. Но я хочу, чтобы ты меня четко услышала. Это не случайно. Это отражение. Внешний мир просто догоняет те внутренние перемены, которые ты уже совершила. Подумай об этом так. Когда ты сажаешь семя в плодородную почву, поливаешь его и даешь ему солнечный свет, появляется росток. Этот росток не чудо, это естественный результат правильных условий. Точно так же, когда ты сонастраиваешь свою энергию с любовью, радостью и доверием, возможности — это ростки, которые появляются. Расцветают новые отношения, приходит предложение о работе, появляется неожиданный денежный перевод. Разговор открывает дверь, которую ты раньше не видела. Ничто из этого не происходит потому, что ты это заставила. Это происходит потому, что ты это позволила. И вот секрет, который так многие упускают. Тебе не нужно контролировать как. Тебе не нужно знать шаги заранее. Вселенная бесконечно мудрее нашего ограниченного ума. Когда ты требуешь знать каждую деталь, ты отрезаешь себя от волшебства. Но когда ты доверяешь, когда ты говоришь «Я готова, чтобы меня вели», жизнь течет такими путями, которые ты никогда не смогла бы спланировать. Контроль ограничивает, а доверие освобождает. Контроль закрывает, а доверие открывает. Контроль утомляет, а доверие восстанавливает. Я помню столько раз в своей жизни, когда я думала, что знаю, как что-то должно произойти. Я планировала, я давила, я нервничала, и ничего не работало. Но в тот момент, когда я отпускала, в тот момент, когда я шептала «Я доверяю тебе, жизнь, покажи мне путь», открывались двери, о существовании которых я даже не подозревала. Случалось ли такое с тобой, когда решение приходило не от усилий, а от смирения? Вот что значит позволить Вселенной течь. Так что вот твое приглашение. Измени свою энергию, а затем отойди в сторону. Говори свои аффирмации. Визуализируй с благодарностью. Почувствуй покой от того, что все уже так. А затем доверяй. Доверяй, что нужные люди, нужное время, нужные возможности уже на пути к тебе, потому что это так. Они всегда в пути. Тебе не нужно гнаться, тебе не нужно умолять, тебе не нужно доказывать свою ценность. Тебе просто нужно сонастроиться, а затем принять. И я хочу, чтобы ты по-настоящему прочувствовала эту истину. Ты достойна легкости, ты достойна потока, ты достойна жизни, где возможности приходят к тебе сами. Ты здесь не для того, чтобы страдать в бесконечной борьбе. Ты здесь, чтобы позволять. И когда ты позволишь, ты увидишь, что жизнь любит тебя гораздо сильнее, чем ты когда-либо представляла. Я призываю тебя сказать: «Я меняю свою энергию сейчас. Я открываю свое сердце сейчас. Я позволяю возможностям найти меня сейчас». Позволь этим словам впитаться. Позволь им осесть в твоем подсознании. Позволь им стать твоей вибрацией. Потому что когда это произойдет, вся твоя жизнь начнет двигаться в гармонии со Вселенной. Давай сделаем небольшую паузу вместе, родная моя, и поразмыслим о том, к чему мы пришли. Теперь ты знаешь силу слов, дар аффирмаций, чудо слов «Я достойна», но мудрость становится преображением только тогда, когда ты привносишь ее в свою повседневную жизнь. Здесь размышления и ведение дневника становятся твоими лучшими друзьями. Это не просто инструменты, это священные практики, зеркала, которые показывают тебе, кем ты становишься. И поэтому я приглашаю тебя задать себе вопросы, которые открывают двери в твоем сердце. Первый вопрос. Верю ли я по-настоящему, что достойна того, чего желаю? Речь не о бездумном повторении слов. Речь о том, чтобы заметить скрытый шепот внутри. Иногда ты можешь произносить аффирмацию, но в глубине души другой голос говорит: «Только не я, еще не время». Этот голос не твой враг. Это просто старое убеждение, которое просит исцеления. Так что запиши это, признай это. Затем мягко напомни себе: «Я родилась достойной. Моя ценность не подлежит обсуждению. Так было всегда и так будет всегда». Второй вопрос. Если бы моя мечта сбылась прямо сейчас, что бы я почувствовала? Закрой глаза и представь тот самый момент, когда дверь открывается. Раздается телефонный звонок. Любимый человек улыбается тебе. Деньги на твоем счету. Тело чувствует себя легким и здоровым. Что бы произошло в твоей груди, в твоем дыхании, в твоей улыбке? Почувствуй это, запиши это, запечатлей это в словах, потому что то, как ты это описываешь, это то, как ты это якоришь. И каждый раз, когда ты пишешь, ты репетируешь свою радость, тренируя свое тело принимать. Третий вопрос. Что заставляет меня откладывать или мешать самой себе? Это не про осуждение, это про честность. Возможно, это страх неудачи. Возможно, это ожидание идеального момента. Возможно, это привычка говорить «начну завтра». Но ты достаточно мудра, чтобы видеть, что это не истины, это шаблоны. И в тот момент, когда ты их записываешь, ты ослабляешь их хватку. Ты начинаешь видеть их как выбор, а не как тюрьму. И если ты выбрала их однажды, ты можешь выбрать снова. Четвертый вопрос. Какое семечко благодарности я могу посадить сегодня утром? Благодарность – это не просто эмоция, это чистота, вибрация, заявление. Когда ты говоришь «я благодарна», ты поливаешь семена завтрашнего дня. Так что запиши 1, 2, 3 простые вещи. Это может быть тепло твоей постели, улыбка незнакомца, вкус твоего чая, дыхание в твоих легких. Каждая нота благодарности – это песня для Вселенной, и Вселенная всегда поет в ответ. А теперь давай применим это на практике с помощью простой, но мощной двухдневной рутины. Тебе не нужны месяцы или годы, чтобы почувствовать перемены. Тебе нужно присутствие, тебе нужно постоянство, тебе нужны 2 дня преданности. Утренняя практика. Когда ты проснешься, прежде чем мир захватит твое внимание, положи руку на сердце и прошепчи аффирмацию 3 раза. «Я достойна всего, чего желаю, и это уже на пути ко мне». Не быстро, не механически, а медленно. Почувствуй каждое слово. Почувствуй, как вибрация твоего голоса проходит через твою грудь. Это не просто звук, это энергия, и твое тело ее принимает. Затем закрой глаза на минуту. Представь, что твоя мечта уже осуществилась. Увидь это, услышь это, почувствуй запах, прикоснись, ощути радость, как будто это происходит сейчас. И, наконец, вдохни благодарность, улыбнись, даже если она кажется маленькой. Эта улыбка – твой сигнал Вселенной. Да, я открыта. Да, я готова. Вечерняя практика. Когда день подходит к концу, удели несколько тихих минут дневнику. Запиши 3 вещи, которые произошли сегодня и которые доказали, что Вселенная уже работает для тебя. Может быть, кто-то улыбнулся тебе, когда тебе было грустно. Может быть, ты нашла монетку на улице. Может быть, в нужный момент пришла идея. Это не случайности, это знаки любви от самой жизни. Запиши их и отнесись к ним с уважением. Затем перед сном снова повтори свою аффирмацию. «Я достойна всего, чего желаю, и это уже на пути ко мне». Скажи это 1 раз, скажи это 2, скажи это 3. Пусть это будет последней вибрацией, которую твой разум унесет в сон. Почему 2 дня? Потому что за 2 дня ты почувствуешь сдвиг. За 2 дня ты заметишь, что твое тело чувствует себя легче, твои мысли добрее, твое сердце более открытым. 2 дней достаточно, чтобы доказать тебе, что ты не бессильна, ты сильна. И как только ты это почувствуешь, ты захочешь продолжать, ты захочешь нести это дальше, потому что увидишь, что аффирмации – это не просто слова, это язык твоей души, призывающий жизнь в проявленный мир. И если придет сопротивление, это тоже нормально. Сопротивление – это просто старое «я», говорящее «но я не хочу меняться». Улыбнись ему, благослови его, а затем все равно повтори свою аффирмацию. Потому что повторение растворяет сопротивление, любовь растворяет страх, а достоинство растворяет сомнение. Так что, моя дорогая, прими эти вопросы для дневника и эти 2 простые ежедневные практики как подарок себе на 2 дня. Подари себе этот эксперимент на 2 дня. Позволь себе поверить в свою ценность на 2 дня. Практикуй благодарность, как будто это твой кислород, и посмотри, как ответит жизнь. Ты откроешь для себя то, что я открыла давным-давно. Вселенная всегда говорит «да» твоей энергии. В тот момент, когда ты сонастраиваешься с достоинством, Вселенная сонастраивается с тобой. Я хочу оставить тебя с благословением, которое окутает твое сердце, как теплые объятия. Ты достойна всего хорошего. Ты достойна любви, здоровья, изобилия, покоя. Это достоинство не то, что ты должна заслужить. Это твое право по рождению. С того момента, как ты сделала свой первый вдох, Вселенная работала от твоего имени, выстраивая для тебя людей, места и возможности. Я призываю тебя помнить, особенно в те моменты, когда шепчет сомнение или страх пытается затуманить твой взор, жизнь не против тебя, жизнь за тебя. Каждый восход солнца, каждый вдох, каждый маленький момент благодати – это доказательство того, что тебя ведут, поддерживают и любят сверх всякой меры. Когда ты произносишь свои аффирмации, когда ты выбираешь благодарность, когда ты открываешь свое сердце, ты вступаешь в поток этой любви. Так что сегодня и каждый последующий день держи эту истину близко. Я достойна, я в безопасности, меня поддерживают, Вселенная действует для моего высшего блага. Говори это с доверием, говори это с любовью и позволь этому проникнуть в каждую клеточку твоего существа. Ты не одна и никогда не была. Никогда. Сила уже внутри тебя, и жизнь готова отразить ту красоту, которую ты несешь. Иди вперед с уверенностью, с нежностью и с радостью. Вселенная наслаждается, давая тебе. И, как всегда, помни, жизнь любит тебя, и я тоже.